Compañeros, welcome to another edition of the SQL Data Partners Podcast, episode 240. Happy New Year, everyone. Also to you, Kevin, Mr. Kevin Fiesel.
Hello.
And to you, Mr. Eugene Meininger.
Absolutely.
So I think now we didn't ask you, Eugene, before we hit record. I asked Kevin. He managed to make it to midnight. Did you manage to make it to midnight?
Yes. Yeah, no, we stayed up till midnight. My spouse likes to do the whole kiss at midnight kind of thing. So
there we go.
And then I went to bed shortly after, but yeah.
Yeah. So I made it to midnight accidentally. And that's mostly because I had a customer with some year-end pieces that it didn't go sideways, but it took longer than we had originally estimated. And so it's anyway, then I was up and the kids weren't going to bed. And anyway, it was, then you're so close, you're like, okay, well,
might as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Anyway, okay, well, so today our episode is Azure Synapse Link. We're going to be hitting up touching base on a few more of the features that have been announced, and we'll give our hot take, on what this is and the little that we know about it, or a little that's been released. How about that? And what we're looking forward to with this new feature.
Yeah.
But as always, before we get into that, we do have a couple of shout outs that I want to pass along. Shout out to Stevie White, Stephen Flanders, Jonathan Jones, Hamid Zamini, Paul Clay, Ramada Casaisis, Mike Walsh, Wooly Sousa, George Walters, Richard Crane, Alex Felice Alves, Kim Tambon, here in Howland Springs even, Teddy Regifo, Peter Jandura, Basudora Jamaran, and Melanie Sumner. So thanks, compañeros, giving us a little
hello to 6 of you.
Yes, they're giving us a little love and interacting with us in some way, shape, or fashion. We do appreciate it, and happy New Year to you all. So as we are approaching, as we've gotten into the new year, 2022, compañeros, if you're looking for database monitoring tools, we have partnered with Solarwinds and can help integrate the SQL Sentry tool into your environment. So you may already have licenses. If you already have licenses and would like to come through us, that'll be a way to help the show. Or if you need licenses, we can help you get those off price of MSRP. So reach out to us, and we'd love to hear from you and put that in play. So,
Carlos knows a guy that fell off the back of a truck.
Yes. Well, he was actually driving the truck, right? But
that makes it easier.
Okay, so today our show notes for today's episode will be at SQLDataPartners.com/Synapse Link or at SQLDataPartners.com/240. Okay, so Azure Synapse Link, and one of the ways we were talking about this before the show was in, I won't say what it's not, but in what it is in how it's been implemented in other technologies. How about that? And so it only seems fitting. So maybe Kevin, you want to give us the lay of the land here and talk to us, give us the intro, the description here.
Sure. Azure Synapse Link is a thing that totally exists. I have to lay this out because there's also the announcement of Azure Synapse Link for SQL Server 2022, which, as Carlos has pointed out, is an announcement of a thing to come, but it is not. There's no publicly available information. I will not have any non-publicly available information. I have plugged my ears and pretended not to listen to any of that stuff so far, so that I can come out here and say, it is a thing which will exist in the future. Now, as of right now, if you said, I want to really play with this Azure Synapse Link thing and see what it can do, there are 2 separate products with the first 3 words being Azure Synapse Link that will give you an idea of what's going on. The first one that was released Azure Synapse Link for Cosmos DB. The whole idea here is I have a warehouse in Azure Synapse Analytics, and I have transactional data in Cosmos DB. Cosmos DB is a perfectly fine document store database for online transactional processing. So if you're working in the world of documents, that's a possible destination for you.
Right.
That's not a place where I want to do any sort of warehousing, where I want to do any sort of analytics, because part of the way that Cosmos works is you get priced based on the overall workload on that machine. Or excuse me, on that product on Cosmos. I shouldn't say it's
service.
a machine.
Yeah.
On that service. So you're priced based on max workload, your throughput, and any analytic query is going to blow that throughput out, probably. Because if you think about transactional processing for documents, is the same as for relational databases. I generally do one record at a time, get a record, post a record. I may update 2 or 3 documents. Ideally, you're updating 1 document, but usually I'm looking for a document based on a key, or I have some appropriate filter, some appropriate index, and I get back 1 or a very small number of results. Now, if I want to do a warehouse query, I'm scanning over a large set of data.
Yeah.
So this is not convenient. What they've done is said, well, how about we make the data available in Azure Synapse Analytics, which is a warehousing product. But getting the data from Cosmos DB into Azure Synapse Analytics means I'm going to have to use some sort of ETL or ELT mechanism. I guess I could use Synapse Pipelines or Azure Data Factory. I could probably write something else. And I still run into the same problem of how do I read these records out without affecting my end users who have that read one, write one type of level. I don't want to bump up how much money I'm paying by a significant portion just to handle ETL operations to grab the latest 10,000 updates and then pipe them over into a warehouse. I instead want to have that work some other way. And the way that it works in Cosmos is that you create with an OLAP store. And this is something that you enable on the account, the Cosmos account. I recommend enabling it before you create any collections on there. Once you've created a collection, getting an OLAP store is maybe possible. I've read that it's possible, but there's nothing available in the portal that would allow you to enable it. And it might still be a customer support call to get it enabled.
Oh, wow.
Versus if you create a new collection, it's a little radio button that says, would you like an OLAP store? Yeah, I do. And what happens there is behind the scenes, your transactional style documents are then stored in a more OLAP friendly format. That's all hit behind the scenes. It's all happening asynchronously as you're making those writes. And that store is made available to Azure Synapse Analytics. This is where you can use a command on a Spark pool to basically select data from that Cosmos destination. You set up a linked service. You possibly set up a managed private endpoint if you have managed virtual networks enabled. And then you can write a select query against that OLAP store, get back your data. This could be a very simple ETL process where I query everything that's changed in the last day or whatever, and then write that to a dedicated SQL pool. But what you're able to do in that case is all of your queries using the Synapse Link for Cosmos DB component do not affect your end users who are hitting that transactional store. So a very long way of saying, here is a way of opening up a connection between your Azure Synapse Analytics workspace and Cosmos DB.
Without blowing the bank or, basically, I won't say you're getting a second replica right? But it sounds like you're getting some behind the scenes support, right? To remove any additional workload that then going to get passed on to you from a compute perspective.
I mean, it sounds
Yes.
like in theory you've got sort of maybe not you've got like a read optimized replica designed for analytics.
Mhm.
Do we know much about how the data is being stored on the back end for Synapse for this kind of thing? Like,
Well, the data is all stored in Cosmos DB there.
In that example, yeah.
And how it's stored is you can take guesses, but no, there's nothing publicly available about how that data is stored.
okay, so, but I mean, isn't it making a copy or something like that?
Yes.
Because okay, so
Once
but
it
for
gets the Synapse, yeah.
yeah, so when it gets
Well,
to
no.
Synapse,
When it's in Cosmos DB, you have two copies of the data. You have
okay,
one that's in your OLAP friendly storage, and you have one that's in your OLTP friendly storage.
and we don't know how they're doing it for the OLAP part. It's just it's Synapse Link kind of thing.
Yeah, just like how we don't know exactly how it's stored for the OLTP side. That's an implementation detail they can change later.
Oh, okay. Because like that's the thing that would make me a little bit nervous about it. Although I guess we should trust in like Big Papa Microsoft that they'll take care of everything.
Take another swig of that Kool-Aid.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm legal. Part of the NDA is that I'm legally obligated to drinks like one glass of Kool-Aid a week. No, just because as I've started to learn more about things like Synapse and some of this like modern data platform, whatever you want to call it, the storage format is like really important, right? Like I was doing work with a customer, and they have which is under a different NDA, and they have, let's say, some API based data that they're storing and they're querying every day or every hour or something like that. And you have lots and lots of data. I mean, well, gigabytes of data, but it compresses super well into Power BI because it's mostly the same data. Sometimes it changes, but it's mostly the same. And Power BI uses a columnar format. And, I was doing work optimizing the SQL backend that was storing all this, right? But then it's like, well, what if we just put this all in Parquet files? And suddenly gigabytes and gigabytes of data turns into like 160 megabytes in compressed Parquet files, right?
Yeah.
And, that's great when you can do like big offloads of data, but for something like Synapse Link, like it's probably not super ideal to like make these small incremental changes. But then there's that whole, I mean, maybe they're using Delta Lake or whatever the cool new hotness is for dealing with that, right? So that's why I'm curious, because like as I'm learning about these file formats and I'm learning about these differences, how you're storing the data as you scale up or as you use stuff like Synapse has a much bigger impact than I'm used to coming from the SQL world,
Sure. And I do want to lay out the 3 steps, because in one of those steps, you do control storage yourself.
Gotcha.
I mean, that first step is Cosmos. When somebody's writing to the document storage, that's all platform as a service. That's, we have a few options on how much you're willing to pay in terms for performance, and that's about it.
Right.
The Cosmos OLAP store, again, not going to make any claims about how they store that data.
Right.
Just that it is.
It's managed. We don't look behind the curtain. It's
pretty much,
care
yes.
for you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is fine. I
and-
mean, if you know what you're getting into, like that's fine. And it's still going to be more performant for the kind of analytical workloads you want to do than whatever's going on with Cosmos, which we also don't know about, right? And it's optimized, like you said, for document database kind of stuff, for individual lookups, individual changes, because you've got all your data in this big JSON blob or whatever.
Yep.
And so anything's going to be better than that when it comes to, oh, I want to scan 10 years of data. Yeah.
Right. And so those 2 elements, although the Cosmos OLAP actually is tied to Azure Synapse Link, that was the whole reason for it to exist, is still only an intermediary, because the final form of this data is when you connect from your Synapse workspace to this Cosmos OLAP storage.
Gotcha.
And can retrieve that data. Now, at this point, you can write it someplace in your Synapse workspace. You could write it in a Parquet format. You could do whatever data transformations you need to do, or you could even write it directly to a dedicated SQL pool. And now it's in a version of SQL Server, or a third cousin of SQL Server.
So, and you may not have the answer to this, but is it that input, that thing that Synapse is able to see, is it being treated as kind of like an immutable stream of events, and you can kind of filter by date and time and that sort of thing? Or is it more of, okay, here's the latest data? Because in the blog post about the SQL Server one, it's just like, there's a change data capture feed. And it's like, well, is this something where, like, for a data lake, I'm treating this as the raw zone, right? And yeah, changes happen, but they're always appended. So I can safely compact and compress and manage the historical data into like this Parquet file. Or is it, no, here's the data as it is right now? Do you know at all?
My understanding is it's the data as it is at the moment.
Gotcha.
So I don't think it's a historical stream. It's similarly with change data capture, where if you, I'm thinking about change tracking, where change tracking basically says, yes, there is something that changed. Go get the latest.
Right. No, that makes sense.
So it may be slightly different with the SQL Server 2022 version, because there's another version of this that's available, and that is from Dataverse into Azure Synapse Analytics.
Mm.
And for anybody who is into the Power Platform space, they know what Dataverse is. But for the rest of us,
I've
usually
lost...
this is Carlos's line.
Yeah.
For the rest of us.
Yes, the other knuckle dragging Neanderthals that are among us.
Except that Carlos, I think, knows what Dataverse is.
Yeah.
So I had to be
That's funny.
to take that role.
Yeah, the common man, Kevin Fiesel.
It's a new year, Kevin. Right? We're a little role switching on the podcast. No, I'm just kidding.
It's all Kefabi here, folks.
Yeah. Well, that's what I think is, well, I don't know if interesting is the right word, is that what, so I guess, well, that is that you have this, change data capture component, but it's really just, it's just another integration to Synapse, right? It doesn't sound like there's going to be all that much to it, other than perhaps you have to turn on, or turn on change data capture. And again, we don't know all the details. They'll be coming, I suppose, when we finally get a release candidate. But that's kind of what we're thinking is it's going to be, right?
Probably. And if it is driven off of change data capture, I think that makes sense. That seems like a fairly straightforward mechanism to do it. And what they're aiming to do is try to make it easier for somebody to say, well, shoot, let's just make Azure Synapse Analytics the warehouse instead of having to manage all of this ETL pipeline work that's internal.
Right.
Whether that will work is going to be a different story. I guess we'll see. Microsoft has been pushing Azure Synapse Analytics really, really hard.
Really,
yeah.
really.
And
yeah.
It's a very interesting set of technologies that ranges from this is really cool to you participated.
Right.
Depending on what you're talking about specifically.
Sure.
But as a whole platform of things to do, there's a lot involved in Synapse, and as long as you don't break the bank by overscaling your dedicated SQL pool and driving your company into bankruptcy, it's a interesting warehousing platform that I think is at least competitive with alternatives, and that includes developing and maintaining your own.
Right.
But
so where I kind of see this, where I'm interested, well, again, this is my take, right? Like, and we'll see.
Worth everything you paid for it, right?
Exactly, right? Worth the cost of admission. So you've got, I won't say old multidimensional, but you've got these multidimensional warehouses that are out there. If an organization, and then let's just say maybe the developers there, maybe they're not, and they want to start and add to it. Now, again, in this scenario where it's something that's already been built, it's functional, people are using it, but the entire of the organization is not quite using it, or the entire of the financial department, right? Like all the pieces aren't quite in there. I could see the wheels turning on with some of those organizations to be like, well, do we really want to go back and build continue to build on our multidimensional model? Or do we just say, hey, you know what, we're gonna start building, let us take this new form, not that it's tabular, right? But for all intents and purposes, right, it's tabular, right? And kind of go that way, and now let me bring in, Synapse, right? I kind of feel like those are going to be maybe not the biggest candidates, but those are the ones I would seriously consider, right? Somebody comes to me and says, hey, I have this warehouse, but I need to add to it, right? I would think Synapse Analytics would be a good candidate for them in that scenario, right?
Yeah, that is a scenario for them. And I think the tricky part is that Synapse has one of those "you must be this tall to ride the ride" type of limitations, particularly with the dedicated SQL pool. It's a lot less so with the serverless SQL pool, but as soon as dedicated SQL pools come into account, you start talking about how many billions of rows do you have? Because if the answer is 0 billions, then it's not going to probably work as well as you'd hope. Because like, just give you an example. I have a fact table. Well, we know that with a clustered column store index in SQL Server, you need 1024 times 1024 rows to fill that row group. That's the maximum number of rows you can put in a row group. And if you get 1024 times 1024 rows in there, you're golden. Okay. Well, your data is distributed 60 ways in Azure Synapse Analytics. No matter what your DWU level is, it's split 60 ways. So now I need 60 times 1024 times 1024. Right. For simplicity's sake, I'll say 60 million. I need 60 million rows for a single row group for this to make sense. Then if you say, well, I do partitioning by month because I want to roll data in and out by month. Right. Okay, so I need 60 times a million times 12. So now I suddenly need about 800 million rows a year before this makes any sense. So you're talking, I'm churning 1 billion rows a year before I could have monthly partitioning make sense. Otherwise, you have half-filled row groups and your performance will be nowhere near as good.
Sure.
By contrast, on premises, you divide that number by 60, and your moderate-sized warehouse with a fact table that has 20 million rows in it can work. It can make sense.
Right.
It just doesn't make as much sense in Synapse.
That's fair.
Unless you go with the serverless SQL pool route, in which case it will be really, really slow.
Yeah. I was going to say, you can't. Performance is not going to be your friend there. At least in terms of real time. Right now, if you're going to suck it all into Power BI or whatever, later, then maybe it doesn't matter. But
yeah, and if you have reports where, look, this thing can run for 5-10 minutes, I don't care. The serverless SQL pools can be a very inexpensive, effective way of storing and retrieving data. Yeah. If you have periodic, I just need to get this thing out once a month, or if you have exploratory analysis where I have a whole bunch of data and I don't want to build all of the ETL processes, that's where the serverless pool can really be really effective.
So we should, right, for my benefit and for the benefit of others who may be out there, when we're talking about serverless in Synapse, now my definition, so correct me where I'm wrong here, Kevin, but my definition is you are getting the virtual, okay, so let me rephrase. I'm going to say I have data, and they could be in Parquet files. Excel is actually the one where we're talking about most often. You have a whole bunch of Excel files. I want to bring those in and query them like I would in SQL Server. I don't want to create a real SQL Server and pay for the compute and storage costs there. So I'm going to create and I'm going to call it virtual, right? Virtual SQL Server. that then my Synapse, or that I can query, right? That's what I think of when I think of serverless. Is I'm not paying for the compute and storage of a SQL Server, but I'm getting the ability to query it like a SQL Server. Is that a fair definition?
It's pretty close, yes.
Okay, there we
To
go.
give you a rough idea, you create a Synapse workspace. You get the serverless SQL pool. It is a built-in pool. You cannot delete it. You cannot add another one. It's all you need. It will allow you to read data from Azure Data Lake Storage, Gen 2.
Yep, Gen 2.
And let you read in one of two ways, using Open Row Set or using Polybase. If you use Polybase, you can create external tables. You cannot create a real table because, like you said, Carlos, this is not a server. This is not a dedicated compute resource for you. That is what a dedicated SQL pool does,
Right.
except that that's massive parallel processing. This is a set of microservices that are all handled behind the scenes. We don't get to see any of this stuff.
Yep.
But it reads that data from data lake storage, exposes the data as a result set, uses the TDS for the data stream. So it looks like SQL Server. It behaves mostly like SQL Server. You just don't create data on there. You don't update data. You just
Right.
select data that comes from files.
Yep.
And as far as pricing goes, it's $5 per terabyte of data used, and that's all the pricing that they give you. So you're not paying directly for the compute. You're paying for the compute because every time you read the data, write the data, if you have a lazy spool, every time it reads from the lazy spool. If you have temp tables, as you write to the temp tables, read from the temp tables, as you post the data out to screen, all of those things that involve shaping, processing, working with the data, you're getting charged for that stuff. In a modern environment, not very much. You may have, if you've got 20 gigabytes of data in your data lake, you could hit that. And if you're using good filters, if you've got things set up appropriately, you may be spending dollars per day.
Right.
Versus
Right.
if you have a very large environment with hundreds of terabytes, you may still be spending a small amount per day if you've got things filtered appropriately. But if you've got a 500 terabyte file that you just scan through because it's a CSV and you need to read the whole thing to get the one line, well, you're paying $500 times times 500 terabytes, which is, I believe the term is a shed load of money.
Yes, the SQL Data Partners approved term. Yes, that works.
If you make it a petabyte, that's now a boatload of money because you just bought somebody a boat.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, right? And again, compañeros, what I would be interested in is from a the podcast perspective, is if your organization is one of those that were like, hey, I really need a way to go from SQL Server to Synapse, I'd be very interested in chatting with you. Come on the podcast. Right. Don't be shy, right? Talk to us about your experience, some of the challenges you were having, because I'd be interested in that use case, right? And ultimately the why. Help us understand a little bit more of the why behind what Microsoft might be thinking here. So
yeah. The one other thing I want to bring up is from an organizational perspective, like
sure.
Synapse is stealing, Spark especially, is stealing all the Power BI people. And I think it's interesting, right? So I know Kim Manis has moved over, Chris Finley has moved over. I think some other people are getting involved. And so if I was starting today in terms of, okay, I need to pick a specialty, right? Like back in 2015 or 2016, I was like, I'm gonna be a Power BI guy. And it's worked out fairly well. But if I was doing that today in the year of our Lord 2022, I would probably go deep on Azure Synapse, just because where I see Microsoft making investments. It feels to me like they're trying to play catch up with Databricks a little bit and with the Delta Lake stuff and latest version of Spark and all that, but they've got a lot of money. and I think they can do it, right? And so, if I was the kind of person who's like, okay, I need a specialty so that I can bill 3 digits per hour as a consultant, Synapse is probably where I would start if I had to go fresh, right? So it'll be interesting.
Welcome, compañeros, to the Synapse Partners.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, unfortunately, Carlos's clientele is Frank's Auto Repair, and so they're not heavily invested in Azure.
I mean,
Look, Frank pays the
clientele
bills.
will
Okay?
Yeah, right. No, I get it.
intimidated by your little cheap shot here, Eugene. Right? My clients are nice people.
Sure.
Good,
Frank sounds like a
people.
nice name. I'm sure he's a great guy. He sends a Christmas card. But
I don't think I do anything with auto parts.
yeah.
Yet.
Yeah.
Compañeros, reach out if you're.
Yeah, right.
That's right.
We'd love to have you on the podcast. No, I mean, you have to give some thought to the type of clients that you're likely to have, right? So
No.
I may not be going as deep into Azure as I would maybe otherwise, because Power BI is a better fit, right, with the kind of work that I do right now.
Sure.
But again, if I was starting brand new fresh, I'd really give it a serious look.
Yeah. There you go. You heard it here first, compañeros. So when
Yeah.
you start billing, all those zeros, come back and visit us. Right? Remember us, small people.
Yeah.
You can join Kevin at the bar. Okay. Is there anything else we need to talk about?
I don't think so.
I think that about covers it for Synapse Link. We'll see what specifics come out with 2022. I'm sure it'll be a little bit different than what we see in Cosmos DB.
Right.
It'll probably be a little different from what we see in Dataverse, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I might have said this on a previous episode, but I'll say it again regardless. I really feel like if COVID hadn't happened, we would be talking about SQL Server 2021. You know what I mean? It really felt like they were starting to hammer down on a 2-year cadence, and that this has really been a year delayed as a result. And
Sure.
so, worth keeping in your mind when you're like, well, why don't they have it out yet? It's like, well, I think everybody's off by a year at this point.
Right. No, that's fair. That's fair. Supply chain, right?
Oh, man.
Okay, well, I think that's going to do it for this episode of the SQL Data Partners Podcast, episode 240 in the books. Thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah.
And Mr. Eugene, if folks want to reach out to you, how can they do so?
You can find me on Twitter at SQLgene or SQLgene.com.
And Mr. Fiesel?
If you enable Cosmos OLAP, then there's actually a secret directory that gets created. You're going to have to SSH into the server and search for the file, and you'll find my contact info.
There we go. So, compañeros, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. Again, if you are thinking about SQL Server monitoring this year and want to take a peek at the SentryOne tool, hit me up. Right? You can hit me up via the email or at LinkedIn at Carlos L. Chacon. Thanks again for tuning in, compañeros, and we'll see you on the SQL Trail. Bye now.
Bye.
SQL Data Partners.